Well, good evening, everyone. First of all, I have a very important announcement. If your license plate is DXN058, your lights are on. So you'll probably need a ride home if you don't go out and shut those off. So good, it's no one in here. I didn't see anybody go running out. I'm Ken Ruscio, Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the inaugural James McGregor Burns Lecture on Leadership and Biography. This lecture, named in honor of one of the most important people in the course of the school's history, will each year bring to campus a prominent biographer, someone whose art and craft help us better understand this phenomenon of leadership. Now, for those of you who don't lie awake at night, wondering just how this emerging field of leadership studies will make its mark, let me bring you in briefly into one of those debates we have among ourselves at the Jepson School. And that is the difference between the study of leaders and the study of leadership. At the Jepson School, we study leadership, a complex dynamic between leaders and followers, a dynamic packed with questions of values and ethics, to be sure, but also a host of just plain observations and facts about leadership, about this relationship between leaders and followers, and how it occurs in different contexts in different times. As Jim Burns has himself written, leadership is one of the most observed phenomena in society, but one of the least understood. It's actually pretty complicated, which is why we have a lot of fun doing our work. Now, here's one of the tricky questions. In the study of leadership, what is the appropriate contribution of the study of leaders? How can the study of an individual help us better understand the process of leadership and further our goal of developing broad-based theory? That's one reason we have established this lectureship, to bring into our discussion those biographers whose work seems to lie at this most important intersection between the study of leaders and leadership. Those writers whose focus on a single leader provides lessons not just about the process, but also about the times in which the person lived, and also this timeless question of leadership. Before I introduce our guest this evening, a word about James McGregor Burns. Jim is a political scientist, a historian, and a biographer. He has written about John Kennedy, George Washington, and most famously Franklin Roosevelt, and received the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize for doing so. And he has written about the presidency, the American political system, global poverty, and most famously, leadership. He is generally credited with founding the emerging field of leadership studies when he published his 1978 book, Leadership. His scholarship, which now spans over half a century, is a remarkably rich body of work that has had enormous influence. He is also a dear friend of all of us at the Jepson School. He was one of our founding faculty members and was the inspiration for the approach we now take in our curriculum and our scholarship and have become known for. Last year, when he completed a 3-year appointment as a senior scholar here, we established this lectureship in his honor as a way of continuing just one of the many conversations he started at the Jepson School. How can the study of leaders inform the study of leadership? Jim has come down from his home in Massachusetts to join us this evening. Jim, would you please stand for a minute so we could express our appreciation for all your contributions? Jim? I can think of no one more appropriate than Robert Dallek to inaugurate this lectureship. Here are just a few of the pieces of information you undoubtedly already know, but I mention as merely a reminder. An eminent historian of the American presidency, Robert Dallek began his noteworthy career at Columbia University, where he taught history from 1960 to 1964. For the next 30 years, he taught history at the University of California at Los Angeles. He spent time elsewhere at Caltech, Oxford, the University of Texas, Boston University, and Dartmouth. And at the moment, from his residence in Washington, he is focusing his attention on a book about Nixon and Kissinger. His book, Franklin Roosevelt and the American Foreign Policy, 1932 to 1945, won the Bancroft Prize in 1980 and was nominated for the American Book Award in History. His 1983 book, The American Style of Foreign Policy, Cultural Politics and Foreign Affairs, was selected by the New York Times Book Review as one of the notable books of the year. Dallek then embarked upon a 2-volume biography of Lyndon Johnson and his times. Both volumes, Lone Star Rising and Flawed Giant, 1991 and 1998, were selected as notable books by the New York Times. His 2003 biography of John Kennedy, entitled An Unfinished Life, examines with great insight the former president's challenging life and times. Professor Dallek writes knowledgeably, but also with style and clarity. His books are indeed the best of biography. Good reads about interesting people, interesting times, and interesting questions about the impact that individuals can have on the course of history. It is our privilege and honor to welcome him to the university and to inaugurate a lecture series that will, we hope, over time, constitute a series of important statements about leaders and leadership. Professor Dallek.
Ken, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I should tell you first off that I like it a lot more than one I got several years back when I was lecturing in the Soviet Union. My host on that occasion, who I like to think had an imperfect command of English, introduced me by saying, Professor Dallek is the author of several distinguished works. They're the kinds of books that once you put them down, you can't pick them up again. Not music to the author's ears. I also like to begin this lecture with another anecdote, and you'll see it has some relevance to some of what I'll say about John Kennedy. And this involves my son, who when he was about 4 or 5 years of age, he said to me one day, Daddy, he said, "You're a doctor, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, yes, but not like your doctor, not like your pediatrician." And he said, "Oh, I know that because you're also an historian." Well, I was delighted that he could make this distinction at so tender an age. But then he wanted to know, does that mean that you make people in the past feel better? I guess that would be known as a methodological breakthrough. So, let's see what I can do for some of these presidents this evening. You know, for the last 40 years or so, I've been studying presidents and their tours of duty, so to speak. And I've been trying to figure out, as Jim has, as the Jepson School does, what is it that goes into effective leadership? Why have some presidents been more effective than others and come down to us through history as distinguished, as great, as near great? Some of them are now seen as ineffective, as failures. And I've tried to understand, what is it about these men and the office which has allowed some to be so much more effective than others? First off, I should say, though, that I have a certain sympathy for anyone who serves in that office. It's probably the most difficult job anyone could ever take on. Thomas Jefferson called it a splendid misery. Andrew Jackson said it was a form of dignified slavery. James Garfield wondered, after he'd been there for just a month, what is there about this office that anyone would ever want to get into it? See? Woodrow Wilson said that you needed essentially a steel constitution to deal with the demands and pressures and cross-currents of the presidency. Herbert Hoover called it a compound hell. Harry Truman said it was like riding on the back of a tiger. You look at the photos, certainly in modern American history, presidential history, of the men who served, and at the end of 4 years, one can see the change in their appearance. The office has taken a toll, has worn on them, has created demands on them that none of them can fully acquit. What's interesting to me also is the fact that out of the 43 presidents we've had, only 16 have won election to a second term. It's really an amazingly small number. Now, George W. Bush is the 16th. Only 12 have served 8 years or more in the office. Lincoln, McKinley, both assassinated, and of course, Richard Nixon forced to resign. So to this juncture in our history, there are only 12 presidents out of 43 who served 8 years or more, and of course, the more was Franklin Roosevelt, who served for a little over 12 years. But I think it speaks volumes about the demands, the pressures, the difficulties of holding that office, and of running again, and of winning a second term. So let me give you, as the core of my lecture, my speculations on what has gone into effective and ineffective leadership in the White House. First off, I would say that the most successful presidents have been men of vision. Vision. The first George Bush made light of this, calling it the vision thing. But vision that you communicate to the country in understandable ways is absolutely essential, in my judgment, for being an effective leader of this country. Franklin Roosevelt may have put it best in his first inaugural, borrowing from the Bible, when he said, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." But it's not just having some long-term strategy, some grand idea of where you want to lead the country, but it's your ability to communicate to the mass of the society in some concise way. You can call it a slogan, I guess, if you want. Theodore Roosevelt spoke of the square deal. And what came across the people was the idea that he was intent on dealing with problems in ways that would serve the largest number of citizens in this country. That we had passed through an age in the late 19th century when special interests were predominant, and that now he wanted to serve what the progressives called the general interest, the common interest. See? And he communicated it to the public by calling it the square deal. Woodrow Wilson struck resonant notes with Americans when he described the new freedom. The idea that the country should move away from the kind of concentration of power and wealth that had sprung up during the late 19th century, so that there'd be a kind of new freedom in the country. Franklin Roosevelt called it the New Deal. Harry Truman captured the imagination of the public with the term containment. See? John Kennedy, the New Frontier. Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society. Ronald Reagan called it the Reagan Revolution. And it meant something to people. What's most interesting to me about this whole business of vision is the fact that the greatest presidential visionary, I think, in our history was Woodrow Wilson. When he announced at the end of World War I that we had fought this war to make the world safe for democracy, and that this was to be the war that ended all wars. Now, of course, both those propositions were flawed. He failed to achieve them. And yet, Wilson is now remembered as one of the near great presidents, not simply because of his vision. He did certain things on the domestic side which were great, which advanced the well-being of the country. But I think above all, people remember him as the greatest presidential visionary in the country's history. Indeed, what I'm struck by is how little people remember exactly what presidents do during their time in office. If you went out in the street and you asked people today, a cross-section of Americans, who gave us Medicare? See? Who gave us Social Security? Now, of course, educated people, lots of them will remember. But I think there are so many millions and millions of people out there who don't associate these programs with a particular president or administration. But what they do remember is presidential rhetoric. What they do remember is an inspirational phrase or idea. See? Franklin Roosevelt, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. To this day, John Kennedy's proposition, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. These words resonate with millions of Americans and continue to give these presidents a hold on the public that I think exceeds even the achievements of their terms. It's so difficult to understand when you look at John Kennedy, for example. The fact is, and in fact I saw this morning on the internet, a Zogby poll asking a cross-section of Americans who they think of as the country's greatest presidents. George Washington, Lincoln, FDR, consistently the top three. John Kennedy, consistently for 40 years now, has been thought of as one of the 4 or 5 greatest presidents in the country's history. And on the face of it, it's almost ridiculous. He was there for only 1,000 days. His accomplishments were very, very modest. None of his domestic issues was passed during his administration. It was Johnson who enacted the Kennedy agenda. And yet he has this extraordinary hold on the public. Yes, he was assassinated, and that counts, but you know, 40 years after William McKinley was assassinated, 1941, nobody remembered who McKinley was. But Kennedy continues to have this hold on the public, and I think it has to do, and I'll talk more about this in a couple of minutes, with presidential personality, but with inspirational hope, with the fact that Kennedy had a vision he called the New Frontier, that he inspired people who to this day think of him as an inspirational voice, as an optimist, someone who thought in terms of a better America and a better world. So I think vision is absolutely essential to a successful, effective presidency. Second, pragmatism. Good, practical politics. No substitute for it if you're going to be a truly effective president. Franklin Roosevelt, probably the greatest pragmatist of them all, compared himself to a quarterback on a football team. He said, I try one play, and if it doesn't work, I move on to something else. Herbert Hoover caught it exactly right in the 1932 campaign when he said that this man, Roosevelt, is a chameleon on plaid. And I think it captured it perfectly. A chameleon on plaid. There was no greater pragmatist after Roosevelt than the man who thought of himself in many ways as Roosevelt's protege, Lyndon Johnson. Johnson studied, thought about, practiced, refined the art of politics. As Senate Majority Leader, and I think he was the greatest Senate Majority Leader in the country's history. He wasn't interested, when he came to the Senate, in serving on a particular committee. He wasn't interested in foreign relations or in the commerce or treasury or in the judiciary, none of those things. He wanted leadership. He wanted a leadership post. And what he did was to cultivate other senators. He had a kind of body of intelligence about what they liked, what was important to them. He wanted to know where their wives wanted to go on a congressional junket. What did they like to drink? What was their favorite restaurant? Were they happy with their parking space? He had a fellow named Bobby Baker who would gather this data. And Johnson, in order to control them, move them, lead them, would develop some talk or other that if a piece of legislation was on the table, with Hubert Humphrey, for example, who he would describe as a red hot, a liberal who was far out to the left. But Johnson didn't care. He wanted to cultivate Humphrey and bring him into camp, so to speak. And what he would do is, if a piece of legislation was on the table, he would rehearse a speech, a talk, and then he'd go out in the corridor. He knew exactly where Humphrey would be, and he would pretend to run into him and say, "Oh, Hubert, I was thinking about you. I wanted to see you. Come on back to the office, or I'll go to your office." And they'd go there, and Johnson would back him into a corner and give him his spiel. See, this was called the Johnson treatment. As somebody said, when Lyndon began breathing in your mouth, you knew you were finished. Johnson loved to tell the story about himself, about him and Richard Nixon. Johnson is a Senate Majority Leader. Nixon, in '58, went to Latin America, was stoned, spat upon, almost killed in Caracas, Venezuela. It was really pretty heroic in confronting that danger. He came back to a hero's welcome at Andrews Air Force Base in Maryland, and Johnson was out there to greet him and embrace him, as other dignitaries were. A few days after that, a young reporter caught up with Johnson on Capitol Hill, and he said, "Son, I saw you out there at the airport the other day, embracing Vice President Nixon. I thought you told me a couple of weeks ago that this guy Nixon was nothing but chicken shit." Johnson said, "Son, what you gotta understand is that in politics, overnight chicken shit can turn to chicken salad." He knew every manipulative trick in the book. So he was brilliantly manipulative. He was someone who wanted, at the end of his career, to have a medical corpsman on the ranch with him in Texas. His health was questionable. He worried about being alone, the need for constant medical attention. And so before he leaves office, in the closing and waning days of his White House service, he went out to Independence, Missouri to see Harry Truman. And he said to Truman, "Harry," he said, "you know, you and Bess living in this big old house here in Independence, getting on years, man. You ought to have an Army medical corpsman from the nearby Army base living here at the house with you." And Truman, gullible, said to him, "Really, Lyndon, can I have that?" And Johnson said, "Of course, man. You're an ex-president of the United States. I'll arrange it." About 3 months after Johnson was out of the White House, a reporter, enterprising reporter, caught up with him on the ranch and said, "President Johnson, I understand that you have 2 medical corpsmen living here on the ranch with you. Is that true?" He said, "Of course it's true. Harry Truman has one." Ronald Reagan was also a highly pragmatic politician, very shrewd. As governor of California, he announced that his feet were in concrete on the issue of the withholding tax. He said taxes should hurt. People should pay them once a year. If they're paying once a week or bi-monthly or once a month, it doesn't hurt as much. They get used to paying these taxes. I want it to hurt. I'm against the withholding tax. The state of California got into all sorts of fiscal difficulty. and he signed into law, Reagan signed into law, the withholding tax bill. The reporters at a press conference said to him, "Governor, we thought your feet were in concrete on that issue." And Reagan smiled and said, "Gentlemen, the sound you hear is the concrete breaking about my feet." He signed into law the most liberal abortion statute of any state in the Union. Said he was against this. He wanted to be reelected. He knew that the majority in the state favored a liberal abortion statute, and he signed it into law. As President of the United States, he described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. When Gorbachev came to power, Reagan in his second term held a series, 4 to be exact, 4 summit conferences with him. And he changed the dynamic in many ways of the Soviet-American relationship. His ideology, so to speak, his anti-communist ideology in some ways, trimmed sail, in the service, to be sure, of America winning the Cold War, but nevertheless in a highly pragmatic way. So I would say, along with vision, pragmatism, essential ingredient. Third, charisma, the power of presidential personality. So important in this modern age of politics with television. Theodore Roosevelt was adored by the public, preaching the strenuous life. Though he wasn't the first one to hold press conferences, he pioneered the use of the press. He also used his family to ingratiate himself with millions of Americans. He had a large, unruly bunch of children, and he would have people into the White House, and it was communicated through the press about the man's private life. He would go out in the mornings, horseback riding, see, and Washington, the boundaries then were up by what's now the zoo in Woodley Park, and he would challenge the newsmen who would tag along to keep up with him. And they would tell stories, anecdotes, that resonated with millions of people. How attractive this guy was. Woodrow Wilson. Wilson gave speeches that some people said were so lyrical you could have danced to them. They were so drawn to this quality of leadership, of his personality. None, however, was more effective on this count than Franklin Roosevelt. FDR, brilliant and ingratiating himself with millions and millions of Americans. He pioneered the idea of the fireside chat, of using radio. He aimed to, in a sense, come into your home, into your living room. 4 days after he became president, the banks in the country were collapsing. And he goes on the radio and gives the first of his fireside chats. People think there were dozens and dozens of these talks. In fact, I think I have it right when I said there were only 31. He spoke to the country on that occasion about the banking crisis, but he never called it a crisis. He described it as the need for a banking holiday. In essence, what he's saying is, don't think of a crisis. This is a holiday. Go out, enjoy yourself for a couple of days. See? There he was, in the White House, sitting beside the fireside, speaking to the country as if he were pater familias. He was your uncle. He was your friend. He was someone who created this rapport that people responded to at a time of terrible crisis. It was brilliantly effective. After he died, somebody stopped Mrs. Roosevelt on the street and said to her, "Mrs. Roosevelt, I miss the way your husband used to speak to me about my government." Can you imagine anyone saying that about a politician today? I miss the way he used to speak to me about my government. As we know, he was paralyzed from the waist down from an attack of infantile paralysis when he was in his 40s. The country, there are no pictures of him during his time in the White House revealing this disability. The only time he ever made a connection to his disability was when he came back from the Yalta conference. And he said to the Congress, "I know you will forgive me for sitting down, for I carry 10 pounds of steel around each of my lower limbs, and I've just returned from a journey of 10,000 miles." It's the only time he ever made reference to his disability. The country found psychological comfort in this man who they thought had recovered from his polio because he had lifted weights and his upper torso. He looked so robust, so strong, so confident, so self-assured. The country, in a sense, identified with him. Here's a man who suffered this crippling disability, and he's recovered, and that's what we can do in the Depression. And in a sense, he played brilliantly upon that personal connection to the public. A good contrast with Roosevelt or with T.R. or Wilson is Lyndon Johnson, who so undermined himself by being a quite unlovable personality. Johnson was a narcissistic character, overbearing, reaching, pushing. He had to be the best, the greatest. He was the first one to get a car telephone for his limousine in Washington, D.C., when he was Senate Majority Leader. His rival was Republican Everett Dirksen of Illinois, Minority Leader. Dirksen went out and got a phone for his limo, called Johnson up. He said, "Lyndon, I wanted you to be the first one I called on my new car telephone." And Johnson said, "Can you hang on a second, Ed? My other phone is ringing." He was such an overbearing and in many ways vulgar character. And he offended people by that and undercut himself. Reagan, the great communicator. What's fascinating to me is when Reagan died so recently, there was an outpouring, not of grief, but it was almost a sense of celebration. There was a feeling about Reagan that he was the great optimist, like a Kennedy, that he inspired hope, that he gave people a feeling that there were better days ahead. Remember 1984? The TV ads, "It's morning in America," "The pride is back." And Reagan is indelibly associated with that sentiment. And his personality made such an important stamp on the country. We in the Academy often think that brain power is absolutely the first and most vital thing for effective presidential leadership. I think there's something else which we can call political intelligence. See? Franklin Roosevelt had it. Ronald Reagan had it. Harry Truman had it. 1948, Truman, everyone said he's going to lose except for Harry Truman. There was hardly a poll, a newspaper, who gave him a ghost of a chance. He's running not only against Tom Dewey, but his party is split into three parts. Wallace on the left, and Strom Thurmond on the right. And here is Harry Truman left with the rump of the party. The power of his personality, he went out on the campaign trail and went around the country giving speeches off the back of the train. And he warmed to the audience and would say to them, "If you vote for this Dewey, if you vote against me, you're a bunch of damn fools. Remember what Roosevelt and the New Deal did for you? You lose track of that, you're a bunch of damn fools." And people warmed to him and started shouting, "Give him hell, Harry, give him hell." And of course we know he won the election Every time a candidate is behind, they always invoke the experience of Harry Truman, and it'll never happen again, probably. Truman was sui generis. And we know that wonderful, famous photograph of him holding up the Chicago Tribune, which says, Dewey wins, saying Truman out. And there's Harry, of course, having won re-election. And again, it's indelibly printed on the public's mind as part of his personal connection to the public. And so I would say the power of presidential personality, the charismatic side of presidents, is now so important in this age of rapid communications and of television. Fourth, I would say, is the issue of consensus. The greatest, most successful presidents have been those who've been able to build a national consensus. Theodore Roosevelt was masterful at this. TR was a great believer in projecting American power around the globe. The public is isolationist, resistant to this idea. TR wants to create a consensus for a larger American role in world affairs. He doesn't talk about power. He doesn't talk about the idea that he wants America to be a competitor with Britain and France and Germany and Russia and Japan. What he speaks to are the country's ideals. He takes the Panama Canal. Does he talk about it as a way to assure the building of a two-ocean navy and making America a power in the Atlantic and the Pacific? On the contrary. He talks about the idea that we are going to be serving the purpose of world commerce. We will advance international prosperity. There's no better example of this, I think, than the role he played in the Russo-Japanese War. Russia, Japan, 1904-1905. TR is a balance of power foreign policy leader. He's delighted when the Japanese attack the Russians because of their transgressions, as he sees it, in Manchuria. And at first he says, the Japanese are doing our work. But the Japanese pile up so many victories so quickly, he's worried that the balance of power will be tipped out to the Japanese over the Russians. And he wants to sustain some kind of balance there. The Japanese are finding they can't finance the war. The Russians are facing turmoil at home, the 1905 upheaval in Russia. TR calls them to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. He'll mediate the conflict. They're worn out, eager for peace. They send delegates to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Why Portsmouth, New Hampshire, of all places? Yes, it's a nice watering hole in the summer, which is when they're meeting. But what's in Portsmouth? The American battle fleet. And in essence, he takes them out, claps his arms around their shoulders, the Russians and the Japanese, and he says, see, in essence, take a gander at American power. All the public hears about is not the way in which he's asserting American power and sustaining some kind of balance of power, but they hear the idealistic side. And what he does is he builds a consensus for this mediation in that Russo-Japanese War by highlighting, underscoring that America is a great pacifist nation, serving the interests of international peace. And of course, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, the first American president to achieve that. And he creates a consensus for this new kind of American adventurism, if you will, in international affairs. One other example. In the 1920s, the country was bitterly divided between what one can describe as the urban modernists and the rural fundamentalists. The famous Scopes trial, pitting the state of Tennessee against John Scopes over the teaching of evolution in the schools. And remember the play, the film, Inherit the Wind, the contest between William Jennings Bryan, the embodiment of old fundamentalist America, and Clarence Darrow, the embodiment, so to speak, of modern, urban America. See? Along comes the Depression, and Franklin Roosevelt, creates a new consensus in the country, a coalition of rural and urban political machines, a New Deal coalition that reaches out across party lines and most of all across regional and economic lines. And he knits together a consensus that lasted for almost 50 years. He was a brilliant consensus builder. And so I would say the most effective presidents have been men who created consensus, created unity in the country. Fifth, the issue of trust, of credibility. Presidents who lose credibility, who lose the trust of the public, cannot lead anymore. Presidents have lost credibility by two things, in two ways. One is if they overreach themselves, as Lyndon Johnson did by promising a great society and promising a war on poverty that would abolish poverty. You can't abolish poverty. You can raise people up. But Johnson, that was his grandiosity, his hyperbole. And the Vietnam War. Remember the famous credibility gap? How do you know when Lyndon Johnson's telling the truth? When he pulls his earlobe, when he rubs his chin, you know he's telling the truth. When he begins to move his lips, you know he's lying. Johnson didn't think it was funny, but it was so revealing, see, of how he had lost his hold on the public. And of course, March 31, 1968, he announces that he's resigning, that he can't run again, because he's lost the trust of the public. The other way you lose the trust of the public is, of course, you lie to them. Richard Nixon, Watergate, that famous press conference when Nixon said, "I am not a crook." That was the day his presidency was over. Because if you have to tell the country, "I am not a crook," it is ruinous to your ability to lead. Bill Clinton, that terrible mistake he made, not simply carrying on with Monica in the Oval Office, but then saying to the country, lying to the country, "I did not have sex with that woman." Now, the country didn't want to impeach him and didn't want to throw him out of office. But this will follow him forever. His historical reputation has been seriously blighted by this kind of lying. Sixth, judgment. Presidential effectiveness revolves around good judgment. In 1941, in the midst of World War II, the Nazis attacked Soviet Russia June 22nd, 41. And Roosevelt's military chiefs told him not to provide Lend-Lease supplies. Lend-Lease, which had been passed by the Congress in March. Don't provide Lend-Lease supplies. We know what the Nazis did to the Poles, ran over that country in a matter of weeks. We know how they defeated the greatest land army in Western Europe, the French. They'll overwhelm the Soviet Union. But Roosevelt knew some history, and he remembered Napoleon and the French and Russia's greatest ally, winter. And he ran counter to what his military chiefs told him. He used his own judgment, and he gave them Lend-Lease supplies. Harry Truman, by contrast, in 1950, accepts Douglas MacArthur's proposition that we should cross the 38th parallel. The Chinese will never come in to fight against us. The boys, MacArthur said, this is November of 1950, MacArthur said the boys will be home by Christmas. And as I keep saying, which Christmas? They're still in Korea. Judgment, Truman showed faulty judgment there. And so, as a final example, John F. Kennedy, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, October of 1962, his military chiefs urged him to invade, to bomb, and he wouldn't do it. He resisted and resorted to diplomacy, a blockade, a quarantine as he called it, which worked. We know now from Soviet materials that we came this close to a nuclear holocaust, to a nuclear war with the Soviets. It was Kennedy's good judgment at that point. I don't want to turn him into a saint. It was partly his fault that we got into the Cuban Missile Crisis in the first place because of the plans, the secret plans, Operation Mongoose, that they had to try and topple Castro. And Khrushchev was able to convince Castro to let him put those missiles in Cuba as a way to defend Cuba from American aggression. But Kennedy's judgment in the final analysis spared us from a nuclear war. And so I would say judgment is yet another powerful element in explaining effectiveness in presidential leadership. Finally, I would say there's the element of luck, happenstance, chance. Napoleon once said, give me generals who know something about tactics and strategy, but best of all, give me generals who are lucky. I wouldn't want to push this point too far. After all, William Howard Taft and TR before him faced similar circumstances, and TR comes down to us as at least a near great president, and Taft largely as a failure. Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt faced similar circumstances in the Depression, and Hoover comes down to us as a failure, and Roosevelt as a great presidential leader. And so, yes, luck is important, but I think more important are those other elements I've described. Those elements which allow a president vision and pragmatism and charisma, consensus and trust and good judgment to really exercise effective leadership. Let me say in conclusion a word about where I think we are now on the matter of presidential leadership. There was a poll this morning I mentioned to you before, a Zogby poll, asking the public to rate presidents. And to my surprise, George W. Bush was ranked in the lower third of American presidents. Not because I necessarily make a case for him as a good president, but because having just won re-election, you would think that the public would be more sympathetic to seeing him as an effective president. I think the country is in a state of demoralization about the presidency. I think the election of 2000 and then this past election, 2004, the country is badly divided. There's been talk that Bush won a mandate. Frankly, this is nonsense. You go and look at the historical record. Bush's margin of victory in the popular vote was 2.7%. It is the lowest, smallest margin of victory in the popular vote ever won by a second-term president. See? You go back to 1824 and chart. Harry Truman won by 4.4%. Wilson won by 3.1%. Roosevelt, Johnson, Nixon, Reagan, far and away compared to what Bush won. I think the country is demoralized about the presidency. I think there's a certain cynicism. I think the fact that you did get a boost in voter participation this time, because in 2000, there was only something like 51% of the electorate who turned out. When Roosevelt ran for re-election, 68% turned out to vote. It used to be that 70 and 75% of the electorate would vote, and people don't see it as that important now. Why? What's going on? I think there's a certain cynicism that comes down to us as a consequence of Kennedy's assassination, of Watergate, of Vietnam, of Iran-Contra, of Clinton and Monica. But you know, at bottom I'm an optimist. This will change. It'll turn around. And you know what I think will do it? Is when we elect a woman as President of the United States. It'll happen. It'll happen. Because it will be seen as a great departure. See? When John Kennedy won the presidency in 1960, it was a breakthrough, the first Catholic to make it to the White House. Does anyone now dwell upon the question of whether somebody is a Catholic or a Protestant? It's become largely moot, relatively unimportant, you see. And I think the same will happen when we get a woman as president. It'll no longer be a question or an issue. I don't know whether she'll be a good president or a great president. And by the way, I'm not making a case for Hillary. I don't want you to get me wrong. But I think when you get a woman, the really salutary thing that will come out of it is that whether she's successful or so-so as a president, it's going to double the pool of potential candidates we can turn to. And God knows, in my judgment, we need better candidates than we've been getting. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Professor Dallek. We will take some questions and answers, and I guess we have a microphone that we'd like you to use so everyone can hear and we can keep track of proceedings this evening as well. So raise your hands and we'll try to get a microphone around to you.
Yes, this gentleman here.
You spoke of luck, sir. To what extent do presidents make their own luck, perhaps through those other factors?
I'm sorry, say again.
To what extent do presidents make their own luck?
Make their own luck.
Make their own luck.
Oh, make their own luck. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think, in a sense, that's what I was saying, that they make their own luck. They seize upon circumstances to advance their presidency, to lead the country. You know, Theodore Roosevelt once said that he couldn't be a truly great president because he didn't have a war, comparing himself to Lincoln. See? But Roosevelt had enough of a crisis in this country. Now, McKinley didn't have the imagination to deal with it. William Howard Taft didn't have the imagination to deal with it. So TR seized upon the circumstances to assert himself in effective ways. So I think, in a sense, they make their own luck, but, you know, there are circumstances that some respond effectively to and others don't. And that's the test of their presidential mettle, see. And ultimately, we get around to judging them on the basis of how they performed. It takes years. Look at Harry Truman. When he left office, his approval rating was at about 32%, 33%. And now people remember him as one of the near great presidents of American history. Circumstances change. We win the Cold War. Containment. We go back to Truman and the containment doctrine. And we see him as, in many ways, the architect of America's Cold War success. So it sometimes takes decades. Presidents also are served or ill-served by who precedes them and who follows them. See, Ronald Reagan was very well served by the fact that he came after Jimmy Carter, who, of course, has been brilliant in his post-presidential incarnation, but as president was less than sterling. I mean, I love that story about how Jimmy Carter wanted to imitate FDR. Remember, he came to the White House, he said he was going to give a fireside chat, and he put on a cardigan sweater, did it on television, sat alongside the fireside in the White House, gave a speech, and everybody went to sleep. He certainly didn't have that. He himself said he wasn't a great speech maker. So, I mean, there are qualities. The difficult thing is, how do you identify these during a presidential campaign? How do you know that someone's going to be good or great or effective or ineffective? It's so difficult to sort that out. It is something of a mystery. What I also find a mystery is why anyone wants to run for the presidency. What I say these days is I think the office is something of a magnet for neurotics. Yes?
You talk about a mystery. You hear that the media or the people had a love affair with Bill Clinton. You hear many times in circles that if he ran again today, he would win.
Yeah.
How do you explain that?
Well, I think people in this country were forgiving about the moniker business because they saw this not as a violation of law or so much of public policy, but as a private transgression. And at bottom, you see, I think people in this country, we're such an egalitarian society. And on the one hand, we need heroes. We want heroes. We want to elevate people we look up to. On the other hand, we love to find out that the heroes have feet of clay because it makes us feel better about ourselves. Gee whiz, that prominent figure went through a divorce. Gosh, they had marital problems. My oh my, they had problems with their children. Well, you know, it rings, it echoes so powerfully with, and so in a sense, Bill Clinton's flaws in some ways endear him to millions of people. And I think also he was, as I said, so charismatic, so appealing in that way. And he is very bright and very articulate. And also, somehow presidents get out of the office and lots of what they did falls away. Richard Nixon, you know, went through a kind of rehabilitation. He lived quite a while after. Johnson never had the chance to do that. He died within 4 years after being president. I don't know if he could have done it anyway. I don't know if he had the temperament to do it. Reagan, of course, was there for such a long time, but enormous sympathy for him over the suffering of Alzheimer's disease. So it is fascinating how the public interacts with these presidents. The society needs heroes, but it also loves gossip and loves to find out about people's flaws, their limitations. And they're ambivalent about these presidents.
You did not mention Jimmy Carter until the Q&A. Could you quickly rate Jimmy Carter on the characteristics you announced tonight?
Well, I don't think he certainly in terms of charisma, he wasn't among the most distinguished of our presidents. He was a man with vision, but he was overwhelmed by circumstances. And somehow or other, he didn't have the wherewithal to create the feeling that he was in command, that he was in control. The Iranian hostage crisis, the problems with oil prices and OPEC, there was a sense that the country was adrift, that there wasn't mastery, but that we were adrift, and that he was not that effective a leader. And so along came Reagan, who had the capacity to communicate in these pithy, simple ways. I mean, we who are academics, you know, decry this. Frankly, I'm pained and offended when I hear George W. Bush mumble and fumble through some extemporaneous comment. See, it bothers me. I'm an academic. But not the great bulk of the country, obviously, or a lot more people than are on my side. See, they don't mind it. They find him more understandable. You know, he's the guy next door. Adlai Stevenson couldn't do it. What do they call him? An egghead. Was not very flattering. It was too cerebral. See, I don't know. Maybe it's what the scion of the Addams family, Brooks Adams, once wrote a book called "The Degradation of the Democratic Dogma." See, now that was a man from on high looking down on our democracy. As Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst possible system except for all the rest. And so we blunder along. I'm very selfish. I would love to come back in a couple of 100 years to see what happened to this country. See, I don't think I'll have that chance. Jim?
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
trying to figure out myself. Before Pearl Harbor, when we were presumably neutral, Roosevelt, I understand, lots of data had come out about this. That's why I'm a little bit kind of. Roosevelt instructed his Navy to be unneutral, to help British Navy protect the lifelines between the U.S. and Britain when Britain so desperately needed aid, where we're still supposed to be neutral, say. And secondly, at a different level, did not inform the American people as to what he was doing.
Yes.
How do you deal with that?
Yeah, it's Jim, it's a wonderful question. I wrestle with this all the time in dealing with all these presidents. I'll speak to your 2 points and then add 1 or 2 of my own. You know, Jim, the way I try and judge this is by asking myself, well, how did things turn out? See? Roosevelt, in misleading the public, in going behind their backs, so to speak, in 1941, over America's relations with Britain, over the response to the burgeoning war. In the final analysis, his judgment was right. I don't mean about misleading the public, but about the fact that the country was bitterly isolationist, or at least was so determined to avoid war. And I think he was right in understanding that the United States could not escape this conflict, that this was a contest between fascism, Nazism, militarism, and our democratic values, our constitutional principles, our rule of law, our system of government. And that, in that sense, I don't celebrate the deceptions, but I give him a certain leeway in terms of the judgment he exercised. On the incarceration of Japanese Americans, he was dead wrong. It was a terrible, egregious error, because the rationalization for it was that they endangered, threatened American internal security, and he was dead wrong. They didn't threaten it. And the Supreme Court later said this was the greatest violation of American civil liberties in the country's history. I think they're absolutely right. And I think Roosevelt will always have to bear that burden of having made a bad judgment here, a real mistake. And he can't escape from the fact that he let Henry Stimson sign the order, so to speak. He was president. And as Truman said, the buck stops here. So I think a lot of it has to do with questions of judgment. I'll give you another example that I've thought about. What happens if Franklin Roosevelt in 1940 or 41 had sanctioned the assassination of Adolf Hitler, let's say 39, before even the war broke out. He had sanctioned this. And it came to light later, historical documents. How would we feel about that? See? Well, I'd say, in principle, I'm dead set against presidents sanctioning any assassinations of foreign leaders. It's so at odds with the rule of law, with American constitutional scruples. And yet, it's a very difficult thing to say, well, I'll condemn him for wanting to have assassinated Hitler. See? We know from history Hitler was a monster. That Roosevelt's judgment there might have been. So I think that's one of the toughest questions. I think Kennedy and his administration made a terrible error in these plots to assassinate Castro. It was short-sighted, it was stupid. I think the Bay of Pigs operation was a terrible error on his part, and he knew it afterwards when he walked around saying, how could I have been so stupid? See? The contrast to what he did in the Cuban Missile Crisis is so striking. So, we as scholars, you line it this way and that way. What I say is that at the end of the book, If I've offended a president's acolytes and a president's critics, then I know I've done my job, because neither side has really come down for me. But John Quincy Adams once said that the historian's principal religion should be the truth. We know how hard it is to pin the truth down, but the closest we can get to it, I think, is what we aspire for. And so I work now on Nixon and Kissinger, and I find certain admirable qualities about both of them, and I find lots of things about them that are really quite offensive, off-putting, and as the Germans say, wie es eigentlich gewesen, history as it actually happened. Tell both sides. I don't mean to be too self-righteous here, but that's what I strive for. That's what I try to achieve. It's difficult, but you've done it yourself. I know. I mean, you struggle to be fair, even-handed. That's what you want.
Do you think if Margaret Thatcher were over here, she'd make a good president?
She would stir up a hell of a lot of interest. And how about, here's my suggestion. I got two suggestions. One is that Margaret Thatcher and Gorbachev come over and run against each other. And the other suggestion is we amend the Constitution and have Arnold Schwarzenegger run against the Democratic governor of Michigan. Both of them, I think, seem to be very interesting politicians. And I wish they could run for president.
I think our time's, we have maybe one more question? Okay. One more.
Do you think that charisma and TV have perhaps decreased the other attributes that a president should have?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I've wrestled with this issue myself. I think in many ways television has been quite pernicious in our politics, because it's in some ways put a premium on shouting at each other, on the negative ads, these TV shows like Crossfire, and people getting in there and generating all this heat and, in my judgment, almost no light. It's a piece of theater. It's a kind of drama. And it doesn't add, certainly not to the dignity of politicians and the dignity of politics. And I think it does undermine the ability of presidents, of politicians, to practice sensible, effective politics. People in politics, I think they themselves are so cynical. This thing that this Tom DeLay or the Republican caucus did, saying that if he's indicted, he can still remain in the leadership. As one of the late 19th century spoilsmen said, nothing is lost save honor. We used to pride ourselves in having honorable people in public life. Public service should be something that's honorable, that's attractive. And it pains me that more young people, talented young people, there are so many bright, talented young people in this country. I urge them, when I teach classes, to think about going into politics. I don't care if you're a conservative or a liberal or wherever you stand, but if you have integrity, if you have a commitment to the larger national well-being, as opposed to strictly self-serving purposes. See? For me, in some ways, it makes me cynical because I read the papers of these presidents. I get behind the facade that they put before the country. And when you see the real men operating behind the scenes, it really is not a lesson in traditional American civics. You see how manipulative and dishonest they can be. See? Occasionally there are some, I don't mean to condemn all politicians, But we need more people, it seems to me, of integrity. That would be my highest premium at this point. People of integrity, coming back into our politics, thinking in terms of the larger interest. That's what I'd like to see. I hope I'll still see it in my lifetime, which will go on hopefully for a little while, but I don't know.
Well, Bob Dallek, you've established a very high standard for those who will follow you in the Burns Lectureship Series, and we are thankful that all of you have joined us for this inaugural lecture, and hope to see you back for many others. I should let you know that we plan to create a permanent record of these lectureships, so if you are interested in reflecting upon this some more and actually reading as well as hearing Professor Dallek's remarks, we'll have those available, I hope, in the very near future. So again, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you all for coming this evening.